The walls came tumbling down. Chapter 2, Wounded, as read by the author. Wounded. The crackling glow of the fireplace, the feeling of being warm, the sun about to set and shining brightly through the window, these were the first things I experienced. Pain was next, pounding pain on the front of my head. Besitos, amor, Jacqueline spoke softly and kissed my cheek. Are you going to live, hombre? She pronounced softly, hopefully, with a quiver in her voice. I was on the living room couch and Jacqueline was sitting holding my hand, Maggie next to her, both looking at me intently as I opened my right eye and squinted out from the bandage at both of them. The look in their eyes, in her eyes, told me that I must be a mess. Jacqueline left, but soon returned with Liz carrying medical supplies on a TV tray, a suture, needle, peroxide, and bandages. Liz was all business as she set the tray down on the coffee table and started taking off the bandages from my head. Maggie made a little whine when she saw the pain on my face and gently pawed Liz's arm away from me. It's okay, Maggie, I assured her. Lay down. She did, but with a little whine to let me know she wasn't in full agreement with my decision. Liz got right to work cleaning the wound and then picking up the needle and thread. I already had this one threaded up, was going to use it on a quilt. Her banter was good-natured, trying to cheer me up. She poked around a little and then got right to work. I'm impressed, she stated. I never saw somebody so accident-prone as you manage to live past 40. I was in too much pain to laugh with her. Needle jabs followed by the odd tugging as a surgical thread was pulled through my flesh. I wish now I had invested a little money in a ballistic helmet back when they could still be purchased. Even an old Kevlar would be better than nothing. Fortunately, though, I had spent some money on a fairly good first aid and trauma kit. Not a sexy, cool thing to buy, but now I was feeling like the smartest guy in the room. When Liz finished, she gave me a pain pill, a leftover from a prescription I hadn't used for a couple of years. I didn't need encouragement to swallow it. Maggie came over to inspect. Our relationship was unique. She was not a pet, she was my service dog, trained to help me with my disabilities. She was also a friend in many ways. Now my friend wanted to know how I was. Good, Maggie, I'm good, I said as I stroked her head. Satisfied, she patted back nearer the stove, curled up and sighed, looking out the window. Outside, the wind howled in the trees. It would snow again tonight for sure. I lay looking at the ceiling and thanked God we had all come through this, realizing now how easy it would have been for the man to aim a little to the left and down. Churchill said, there is nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at without result, and I knew that to be true. The first time our unit saw combat, I remember, we were pumped up on adrenaline. We hadn't lost a single man, not even the Kurdish commandos, who were notorious bullet magnets. We felt invincible at that time. Later, the adrenaline wore off, and we were exhausted. At the end of the day, though, it's always important to sit down and have a no-nonsense look at what happened while it's still fresh in your mind. I went over the mistakes I made as a leader earlier, and the ones we had made as a group, and thought of the things we needed to do. First, somehow, they had gotten right up on us. Only by the grace of God and Maggie's keen senses did we avert a complete disaster. They were able to move undetected to within 100 feet of the house. One solution would be to post guards 24/7, but with 4 people, that would be a burden we could not sustain for long. We could, however, put up some sort of early warning, even something as simple as little tanglefoot wires hooked to cans with rocks in them. Maggie would hear that for sure. A partial solution at best, though. Second, that stone absolutely had to come down. It served no purpose for us, but gave an enemy good cover and concealment. I remembered a story from World War II about how the German army figured out the arc and trajectory of their machine gun bullets, and they sloped the ground accordingly along their Ruhr River defenses. Allied troops would be subjected to murderous grazing fire from German machine guns mounted on calibrated tripods firing just a few hundred yards away from the other side of the carefully and deliberately sloped terrain. The bullet's natural trajectory would normally cause the round to plunge into the earth after a set distance, but the German engineers had sloped the ground downward. The thing that made it most effective was not just that the Allies could not see the weapon that was firing and being guided in by a remote spotter. Rather, it was the belief that they were under cover and concealment, and laying in the prone position, which normally afforded good protection, they were instead slaughtered by machine gun bullets skimming just 3 to 4 inches parallel with the ground for the entire path of the bullet trajectory. Our stone wall was on this side of the drainage ditch. We would take the stones away and use them for one of the many projects around the farm, and then grade the edges of the ditch gradually downward. This would help shed water in a swale effect and also provide false cover to anyone using it. From the second-story bedroom windows, we could easily shoot them. Third, there were too many other places someone could have cover and concealment near the farm, mostly behind trees and bushes. The military term for removing such was clearing fields of fire. Since we would need that land cleared for growing crops anyway, it would serve as clearing fields for crops as well as for fire. Finally, I didn't want us to be fighting from the house at all. That was a bad last option. Even if we won the battle, we would incur losses that we may not be able to recover from. Steve and Jacqueline had shot through and shot out 2 of our own windows, and some incoming had taken out a 3rd window. Fortunately, I think we still had some leftover plexiglass sheets in the barn from the greenhouse project. Although not as clear as glass, it was much better than taping garbage bags on the house or boarding up the windows with plywood. Fortunately, they had only fired a few rounds at the house before they turned their attention on me. Still, nobody wanted or needed all their windows shot out and bullet holes in the wall, electric wires severed, and plumbing destroyed. A better option would be to engage the enemy away from the home. In the military, we did this by sending out patrols and ambushes that could intercept potential attacks and scouts before they found our defenses. There were too many problems with supporting this, though. If pulling guard duty was an impossibility, mounting foot patrols while trying to run a farm and homestead was more so. The idea of patrols might work, however, but only if we could organize as a community. A town of 200 people could sustain presence and security patrols on a frequent basis. This is similar to the concept that police patrols use. They don't actually stop everyone in the act of every single crime. Rather, it serves as an overall deterrent. It makes the bad guys want to go somewhere the police are not. I thought of the neighborhood watch signs and even the alarm system installed signs people put out. It did deter criminals from attacking you by making it seem like the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze. We didn't have the personnel to save the earth and rid it of all crime, so this might be the route we would have to take. Make it look like we weren't worth the effort. There were easier pickings elsewhere. I had a gruesome and morbid vision of skulls on top of spears from a Tarzan movie. That would be a certain deterrent, but not the sort of thing most decent people would want to do. Talk about traumatizing the children. The most effective sign I ever saw was the one that was hand-painted with poor spelling and a couple of backward letters thrown in proclaiming all trespassers will be shot. I mean it. The E's were all painted backwards, as well as misspelling the words trespassers and mean. It conveyed violence and the idea the person was just ignorant and crazy enough to shoot anybody for any reason who came onto that property. I pitied the meter reader, but then maybe that guy was also off the grid, as well as off in other ways. It definitely kept me from trespassing, though. The pain pill was kicking in, and I felt a whole lot better. I looked out the window at the trees swaying in the breeze. Sunlight, brightly reflecting off the snow, made it look deceptively warm outside. I thought back to a time before all this unpleasantness, how such a day I would go skiing or just walk to the general store for a cup of coffee. My mind went back to the task at hand. Perhaps signs in conjunction with some foot patrols would do the job after all. We could put the signs along the likely avenues of approach, the main roads in, as well as the snowmobile trail, and especially at the bridges, where these would be choke points. Most people don't like to wade or ford a river, especially as cold as it gets up here. An idea began to form in my head as I drifted slowly off to sleep. Hunters. I'm telling you all, there's greedy folk that's sitting on mountains of food and blankets, medicine and gasoline up there. The man's voice was loud, raspy, and deep. At 6'2" and 250 pounds, Greg was an intimidating figure of a man, if not a sloppy one. Now he was brandishing his deer rifle on his hip as he spoke from the bed of his pickup truck to a crowd of some 30 people milling around a large bonfire nearby. They got enough to feed us for months, heck, maybe even years. The crowd around him, dirty, unkempt, unshaven, and smelling badly, stirred and mumbled in suspicious approval. "If it's so good," a heckler sneered, "why don't you go get it yourself then, Greg?" Laughter followed by cheers as others voiced their agreement. Another said, "Yeah, big man, why ain't you getting it for yourself?" More laughter, but under it all the crowd was contentious and suspicious of the man and of each other. When WROL had hit, they had all come to this state park and had begun hunting from it, just as they had in previous peaceful times. At first they were cordial, if not suspicious of one another, sharing sometimes. Eventually, though, the game played out. It wasn't long after that before the arguments and actual fights had started. When they started raiding the Amish farms nearby, though, they had sort of all pulled together. The camp might have broken up, except the people knew they had nowhere to go. This was their only plan, and it wasn't a good one. It wasn't working. They had therefore bought into Greg's plans willingly. Desperate people do desperate things, and usually fall for any strong leader, regardless of how poor his character, his morals, or his scruples. Greg was the epitome of a tragic lack of all three. Greg would have indeed gone in alone, but he knew these survivalists were usually well armed, and he didn't want to get shot. He would instead get as many as he could, perhaps all, to go with him, and some of them probably would get killed, leaving more for the rest. He knew that at best the survivalist retreat would feed the whole disheveled mob for maybe a month before they needed to find another target. Still, he thought, although well armed, they made juicy targets and worth the effort. Best of all, they seemed to be in little isolated pockets, easier to knock over that way. The first raid Greg took them on was against an Amish farm he had seen when hunting here years ago. They had been friendly enough when Greg crossed their field at that time, waving at him. He knew that the Amish had no guns, which made it easy as taking candy from babies. Greg's group had simply driven in on snowmobiles, armed and pulling sleds, held the entire farm at gunpoint, loaded the snowmobiles and sleds up with whatever they wanted, and then ridden off. They left the poor Amish with next to nothing. Some of the group had broken things as they ransacked the house, and only because some of the men had brought their wives along had there not been any raping. Greg had seen the way some of the single men were eyeing the Amish women and had heard their comments toward them. He shrugged and chuckled to himself, well, boys will be boys. None of that was his problem anyway. This was a rough and unsavory lot of people to be sure, and he was hooked up with them. To top it off, they were getting worse as they got hungrier and colder. Additionally, there weren't a lot of Amish farms left around here to hit. Indeed, the ones he had scouted earlier this morning were already picked over by someone else. The low-lying fruit done been picked, he mused. One of them had a recently marked grave in the yard, and the women looked like they had been beaten up, too. Too bad for them, Greg thought pitilessly. Only by chance had he stumbled on the survivalist treat later that morning. He could tell they weren't Amish because the man had an AR-15 slung across his back and a pistol on his hip. So had his pretty little wife. They had frozen in their tracks when they saw Greg riding by, and he gave them a deceptively disarming wave. They smiled and waved back, and Greg laughed to himself, thinking, damn fools, if only they knew what I'm bringing back soon. They wouldn't wave, they'd run and hide. Greg laughed all the way back to the camp. Quiet, he shouted over the roar and din of a dozen angry conversations and discussions. Look, Greg began, it's going to be easy. We sneak up on them, shoot them from the bushes, and then go in and take all their stuff. The crowd murmured, numerous discussions erupting at once. What if they see us first? One man shouted. Yeah, what about that, Greg? Another yelled. Holding his hand up for silence, the crowd eventually quieted and he spoke. Ain't no guarantees, Jimbo. Everybody's got to die sometime. Question is, you want to for sure die slow of hunger and cold, or you want to maybe die fast but with a chance to get yourself a big pile of food and ammo and gasoline instead? The crowd shouted their approval, albeit angrily amongst themselves, but Greg knew they would all be coming along. Tomorrow morning we ride. I found one of them retreats today, Greg shouted. It's about an hour's ride from here to the north. We'll get on the trail at 8 a.m. sharp. Anybody doesn't go, doesn't get nothing. Satisfied, he hopped down from the truck and shuffled over to his dark travel trailer. The bumper pull ham can trailer was his hunting trailer, and right now it was bitter cold, being mostly uninsulated and now without propane. Inside it stank too, because neither he nor Brian wanted to open the windows and air it out. Heck, it would become even more like an icebox if they did that. Greg and Brian had grown up together. Greg was the smart one, and Brian was the not-so-smart one. Brian was huge, much bigger than Greg, towering in at 6'6" and nearly 300 pounds. Inside the trailer, Greg stripped off the grimy parka and flopped down on his equally grimy mattress and pulled out the bottle of whiskey from his back pocket, taking a long pull before corking it up and setting it on the windowsill. Greg was scheming. He had thought of taking over one of the Amish farms by himself. It would have been so easy to do, just send them packing at gunpoint, except he knew nothing of farming with horses and little about farming in general. Sounded like way too much work for good old Greg. What he needed instead was one of those survivalist retreats like he had seen on National Geographic, with a big pile of food, fuel, generators, a tractor, guns, radios, medicine, and more. Problem is, those places were all so far away or impossible to find. Still, he knew there had to be one out there nearby. He thought about generators, damn noisy things, and suddenly it dawned on him. He could just listen for the sound of a generator and follow it in and sit back and observe. He'd need a good retreat, though, not like that little shack he had seen earlier today, but a big place, maybe one owned by a rich fella. He couldn't take his whole crew, though. They were like locusts. They would eat everything in sight and steal the rest. Some of them were lazy, too. Not that Greg was much better. He relied on Brian for doing his actual work, though. Brian was devoted to Greg ever since high school. Poor old dim-witted Brian. He was hard-working, obedient, and loyal, qualities Greg admired in others, especially if they were easy to manipulate. Greg would be the brains of the new place, and Brian would do all the work. Yeah, that seemed like a fair enough trade. Greg took another pull on the bottle and dreamed about his very own survival retreat with all the bells and whistles. Maybe they'd find one with a good-looking woman or two, keep them around for cooking and other woman stuff. Greg slipped into a deep sleep with visions of living an easy life dancing in his head. This has been Chapter 2. The Walls Came Tumbling Down, read by the author.